Okay, this is a light source, and this is my hand. And as you can see, illuminating my hand necessarily, as a necessary concomitant, produces a shadow behind it. And there's no getting around this fact. Interestingly, the light of consciousness itself, of knowingness, does precisely the same thing, but in a psychological sense. That's why the term shadow is actually perfect for this. To be conscious of anything means, by definition, that we throw other things into darkness. For example, what's 7 plus 3 plus 14? I don't know, some random math question. If you try to work out this problem in your mind has to kind of narrow its attention to those numbers so that you can work out the calculation. But in order to do so, you need to momentarily shut out whatever it was you were previously conscious of, thereby casting it into darkness, so to speak, into the shadow. Of course, consciousness isn't a straightforward matter. Just to be conscious of something doesn't necessarily mean that you have a good grasp of it, a grasp of it that necessarily reflects reality. We very oftentimes simplify the world out there to make it easier to approach. But this always comes at the sacrifice of nuance and complexity. Furthermore, we tend to cast things in a particular light. For example, if you view this guy as a freedom fighter or a terrorist, you are conscious of him, but you're conscious of him in different ways. One is in a positive light, the other is in a negative light. Now, this capacity to think in terms of positive and negative is actually very important and very critical for the formation of the psychological shadow. This tendency can be referred to as the archetypal shadow. The fact that we tend to think very naturally in terms of negative and positive can be attributed to this archetypal shadow. We need a function in our brains, in our psyches, that tells us something is bad. Either a person who is potentially dangerous, a potential rival, or a potential antagonist, somebody who's untrustworthy, or like a dangerous mushroom or animal. We need to have a sense of the bad. And when we sense that something is bad, our minds tend to repel it. And by this, I mean we try to destroy it or we try to flee from it. We try to create a boundary between us and that object. And this is how we deal with danger. And even more simple things. For example, when you're angry with somebody, even temporarily, you not only view them in a more negative light, but you also adopt a kind of attitude of hostility towards them, like you're trying to destroy them. Not in a literal sense, but perhaps in a psychological sense. You're trying to beat them in an argument, for example. And it's more like you're pushing them away rather than trying to construct your relationship and rebuild, so to speak, and be cooperative. Now, that was a very brief explanation of the evolution of the archetypal shadow and how we kind of apply it to different things in our environment, but keep it in mind as we'll return to it later on. Now, we use consciousness to throw light upon very many things in the world, and arguably the most important thing that we're conscious of is ourselves. You have in your mind a particular conception of yourself. You probably ascribe various personality traits to yourself, and you probably have a good sense of what your moral beliefs are, and what skills you have. And this is the ego. And the ego itself is a kind of complex which sits at the center of consciousness. When you're conscious of something, you get this sense that somebody is conscious of it. I am the person who's conscious of it, and that's your ego. Now, the ego is who you think you are. Now, that might sound strange, because who could possibly know you better than yourself? And this is where I have to get back to that kind of paradox of consciousness, which means to know yourself, to be conscious of yourself, inevitably entails throwing certain elements of yourself, certain personality traits and certain aspects of yourself into the dark. Many factors go into the construction of an ego. Your upbringing, the role models you attempt to emulate, your culture, which is really important actually in the formation of the ego and very understated. For many people, it's their ethnicity, their nationality, their religion. All of these things come together to build a sense of identity regarding who you think you are. But any conscious picture of the self is going to be one-sided, because what the ego does is essentially creates a boundary. It creates a boundary between self and non-self. And depending on what it values and deems important, the ego may throw certain traits into the category of not self. This does not belong to me. I don't identify with this. The key is that your consciousness of yourself, who you think you are, is likely to be relatively inaccurate or at least incomplete. People tend to think of themselves mostly in a positive aspect, attributing to themselves character traits like intelligence, humor, whatever, but this may not reflect how other people see you. This is what I mean by the shadow, the personal shadow to be specific. And before I discuss anything more, I think I'm going to show you a clip from Gordon Ramsay's Kitchen Nightmares, so enjoy that.
What I do normally is good. I don't have people sending things back to me.
You don't know, Amy.
The sauce is delicious. The raviolis, we think that they're very good.
What I'm struggling with is that you convince yourselves that it's right.
We have been attacked.
attacked?
Attacked.
Why are you behaving like this?
Because I'm insulted. You verbally insulted me yesterday, and I held my
told you
tongue
the
out of
truth.
class. I didn't tell you the truth. I didn't
Why are you
say
pointing?
nasty things to you.
So we can analyze what was going on here. Essentially, Gordon Ramsay is trying to fix this woman's situation. She's a restaurant owner, but apparently she's not a very good chef and her food tastes terrible. But she's convinced that her food tastes good and that she's an excellent chef, and this is how she perceives herself. Her ego is that of a competent chef who makes delicious food, but the reality is otherwise. But because her ego is so convinced of this ego conception that she's built for herself, she refuses to even acknowledge the possibility that her self-conception is inaccurate. Notice also that she perceives Gordon Ramsay as like launching this devastating attack against her personality, and so her ego's desperately clinging on to any notion of its previous self-conception. And this ego defense, the way it's defending itself, is an attempt by the ego to conceal the information that threatens its stability. It's trying to hide the fact that she's actually not a good chef because it doesn't want its previous conception to break down. It's really threatened by that prospect. Now, there's a distinction to be made because we can divide the shadow in various ways. We can divide between traits of the shadow, of the personality, which are deliberately cast in a negative light. So like personality traits that you don't want to identify with, regardless of whether or not you actually possess them. But there are also those traits which we just simply don't know. For example, the other day I noticed that one of my friends, whenever he would think, would look into like the top corner of the room. And I let him know, like, do you notice that you do that? And he didn't notice. And the thing is, that's a part of his personality, a part of his psyche that was in the dark. He wasn't conscious of it, but it's not as if like he rejects it right away. It's like, oh, don't be ridiculous, I don't look in the corner. It's more like he just didn't know about it. And so we can distinguish between those traits which a person actively rejects and those traits which a person is just simply ignorant of. And this is exactly what's going on with this woman. There are certain traits which other people can clearly see belong to her, but which her ego simply rejects, and is in fact very hostile to those apparently negative traits. So everybody has a shadow. We each view ourselves in a very particular light, and so inevitably exclude contents which seem to contradictory to our self-image. And of course, everybody's shadow is different, and the exact character of every individual shadow can vary greatly. For cultural reasons, a person may value being like super manly and super Chad. I'm eager to see what culture I use to depict this. Hopefully Russian Cossacks. I've been on a huge Russian history binge recently. God, I love Cossacks. But in such cultures, it's very common for femininity to be repressed into the shadow. And so people take it as an insult to be described as feminine or girly, even if it's objectively true. But alternatively, you may live in a culture where masculinity is seen as toxic. And so you may repress your aggression, for instance, and because people may view as aggression as inherently bad. And so you may hide your own sort of aggressive impulses from yourself. The average person is, according to Jung, very and utterly incapable of recognizing their own shadow and dealing with it honestly. For which reason we project our shadows outward. Whenever we recognize somebody who has our shadow traits, it tends to piss us off more than usual. It's our unconscious's way of kind of like acknowledging, in a sense, our shadow contents, but without kind of identifying the shadow contents as belonging to ourselves. It's not owning up to it, so to speak. Now, actually, it makes a lot of sense why somebody would refuse to acknowledge their darker side. Even this woman in the Gordon Ramsay clip, she seems completely bonkers and laughable, but most people, even me, are like this to an extent. There's always something about ourselves which we believe that we're not willing to give up or not willing to modify. And so in that sense, I would actually encourage you to kind of sympathize with her because she's not that different from the average person. For example, if somebody questions your intelligence or my intelligence, most of us will have at least a similar reaction. And again, this is completely normal. The ego wants to be stable. That's its kind of nature. It doesn't want to be always breaking down. It wants to kind of have a stable sense of self. Because without that, it's very hard to survive as a person. Now, there are many problems which the shadow causes. I can't really even name them all right now. But in the case of this woman, the problem is that she cannot ever improve and become a better chef unless she acknowledges the problem. The only way she can improve is if she allows the criticism to do its work and to actually kind of fix her and show her what her ego refuses to see. So even though examining one's shadow feels like this destructive act, it feels like you're bringing your ego down, it's the only way to actually improve if you want to improve. If you don't allow yourself to be criticized, you won't be able to improve. Now, this is obvious because whenever a yes man is in charge, things go to shit. The best leaders are those who can take advice from others in order to see what they can't see. Now, I'm pretty sure everybody knows somebody who's like stubbornly opinionated and won't change their beliefs no matter what. And this is also related to a hyperinflated ego. When the ego becomes too inflated, it feels like it needs to fend off every sort of perceived attack, even those that seem insignificant. This is why I've tried to cultivate within myself, not perfectly, obviously, but an attitude of being open to criticism and willing to accept honest criticism. Yes, criticism stinks. stings. It feels like the death of your ego. But it's good to know so that you can actually improve rather than just kind of being stuck and not being able to grow as a person. And it is rather difficult to develop the kind of mindset where you learn from acknowledging the shadow instead of being simply offended by it whenever somebody else points it out. But this kind of mentality, I think, is very conducive to human spiritual evolution. When we examine our shadows, we feel terrible about ourselves. Our flaws become obvious and exposed, and we feel that we aren't living up to the ideals that we set up for ourselves. But to say something encouraging, we're only human. I mean, what do you expect? Everybody should expect to have some flaws. Nobody was born perfect, and nobody can stay perfect throughout the duration of their lives. Everybody's going to make mistakes, and everybody's going to have character traits which they don't like about themselves. Everybody is flawed, but acknowledging your flaws and acknowledging your dark side is the first step on being put back on the road to redemption. And furthermore, it's possible that what we're concealing in the shadow isn't actually bad. It just may be out of alignment with what society considers normal. Because again, societal norms have a very strong influence on forming our ego boundaries. And so it's possible that whatever lies in the shadow could actually be beneficial to us if we figured out how to utilize it and how to harness it. And this is what integrating the shadow is all about. I'll probably make another video about that whole topic. But I hope this explanation was clear, nice and simple. If you want me to discuss the shadow more, I'll be happy to do so. Just let me know. There's a huge number of topics I can talk about just regarding the shadow itself. And I do have a video, I'll put a link in the description, that goes over everything regarding the shadow, like a full, complete breakdown of it. But I'm always down to get into the specifics, like integration, projection, the collective shadow, and sort of like the wider philosophical ramifications of the shadow and whatnot. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed. Go in peace. See ya.